How to use variables to write outstanding hypotheses. So first, before we begin, we need to set up. So turn to your next fresh, clean sheet of paper in your notebook, and we're going to set it up. So at the top of the page, you're going to make 3 marks. A mark at 4 centimeters, another mark at 9, and another at 14 centimeters. Using those marks, you're going to draw 3 vertical lines down the entire page. Then from that very top line, you're going to count down 6 lines and draw a line across. You're going to do this 3 more times. So at the end, you have a grid of 3 across, 3 columns across, 5 rows down. At the top, you're going to label the page and the columns. Notice the very top row, I erased the middle lines, so it's one big box. So what is a variable? A variable is an important part of science projects and experiments. It's basically any factor that can be controlled, changed, or measured in an experiment. Scientific experiments have several types of variables. Please pause the video and copy these notes into your composition notebook. So an independent variable is the one condition you change in an experiment. Please remember, we only ever change one variable at a time. Changing any more than one variable will make sure you will not be sure if that variable actually affected your outcome. So you have to make sure when setting up an experiment, one variable is changed at a time. So if you're not sure what the independent variable will be in your experiment, ask yourself the following 2 questions. What am I changing and what am I testing in this experiment? By answering that, you'll figure out the variable. So a really good example to illustrate this is you're doing chores to earn your allowance. For every chore you do, you earn $3. So what is the one thing you're changing in the experiment, or what are you testing? Right? So what's your independent variable? It's the amount of chores you're choosing to do because you have control over it. That's what you're changing. Please take the time right now to pause the video and copy these notes into your composition notebook. Please notice there is an example column. We are going to be doing some examples throughout this. You are responsible for writing your examples in. The answer to the example will not be on, I will not have it shown. Make sure you do it. So, in this scenario, and we're going to be looking at the scenario several times throughout today's notes, we have Jimmy likes to work with his friend Joe on 7th grade science class labs. However, he notices that he tends to get lower grades when he does work with Joe because he and Joe like to talk about basketball and not science. He's decided to investigate the problem. If his science lab grades are higher when he works with Joe, or if they're higher when he works with someone else, how can he set up his experiment? In the example column or independent variable, please write down the independent variable Jimmy is testing. The dependent variable is the variable that is measured or observed. It's your quantitative data. So if you're not sure what your dependent variable is, a good question to ask yourself is, what am I measuring in this experiment? So for example, we're going back to the earning the chores. So if your independent variable was the amount of chores, then your dependent variable would be how much money you make or how much money you earn, because the amount of money you earn depends on how many chores you do. The dependent variable depends on your independent variable. We are really looking at cause and effect. If I change this, then what will happen? At this time, pause the video and copy the notes into your composition notebook. So going back to Jimmy's issue. Jimmy, again, he's going to be testing something. It says he's going to be figuring out if his grades are higher when he works with a different person or Joe. So what is the dependent variable in this? What is he going to measure? Please write this in the dependent variable example in your notes. The control variable, these are the conditions that will remain the same during your experiment. It's important to note what stayed the same in your experiment so you know what your results you are seeing are not caused by these factors. Many experimental designs measure one variable at a time. Any other factor which could potentially influence the results have to be correctly controlled. We have to make sure that they are not affecting our results. A failure to isolate your controlled variables will result in you running the experiment because you cannot rely on the results. So when you're doing the control variable, ask yourself, what am I keeping the same? So an example, you're doing an experiment on which laundry detergent cleans clothes the best. So I'm going to be changing my laundry detergent. I'm going to be measuring the amount of dirt on my clothes. Well, how do I confirm that it's the laundry detergent and not a multitude of other factors? That's where my control variables come in. I'm going to make sure they have the same washing machine, the same type of dirt, the same amount of dirt, the water temperature is the same laundry cycle, the same type of material being washed. These are all ways I can try to out any other factors. So the only thing that I can get results on are the type of laundry detergent. At this time, pause the video and copy the notes into your composition notebook. So back to Jimmy and Joe. In this experiment, what variables should Joe keep the same for reliable results? In the example column in your control variable, please write at least 3 control variables that Jimmy needs to put in his lab to make sure he can confirm that it is Joe that's distracting him and is bringing his science lab grade down. So many times people confuse control and constants. Now this is for several reasons. They both start with the letter C and both deal with something staying the same. Now, but in the case of a control group, this is a group that you're exposing to the normal conditions. In your experimental group, you're changing an independent variable, but in the control group, you're making no such change. That way, you can compare your experimental group and your control group and know that the results you are seeing are actually caused by the change in the independent variable. If you didn't have a control group, you might think something changed because of the independent variable, when in fact, it was just because of other factors you hadn't even noticed that were affecting everything. Just so you remember, variables and constants are part of your experimental group, and the control is a separate group that's not being tested, but is still being observed. If you see the same changes in both your experimental and control group, it means the changes were not a result of your independent variable. So your experimental group is the group being tested on, and the independent and the control group, they're exposed to everything that the experimental group is exposed to, but not changing that independent variable. At this time, pause the video and copy your notes into your composition notebook. So let's very briefly go through some examples of variables. The higher the temperature of water, the faster an egg will boil. So what are you going to change? Or what are you going to test? Well, in this case, we are changing the temperature of the water, and we're measuring the time it takes to boil an egg. Controls are the egg size, the amount of water, and the temperature of the stove. Another example of variables, students of different ages were given the same jigsaw puzzle to put together. They were timed to see how long it took to finish the puzzle. The independent variable, what did we change? Ages of the students. Dependent variable, what did we measure? Well, how long it took to finish the puzzle. Controlled variables, it's the same puzzle and the same environment. Now that you understand how variables work, we can use them to write effective hypotheses. Before we can get started, we need to go and set up our hypothesis notes. Turn to the next page. From the top line, count down 7 lines. Draw a line across the page from the left red margin line to the right red margin line. From that line, count down 8 lines. Draw a line across the page like you did prior. And then from that line that you just drew, count down 8 lines. You should have 4 rows. Now draw 3 vertical lines from the first line you drew to the bottom of the page. So you should have 3 lines, one at 4 centimeters, one at 9 centimeters, and one at 14 centimeters. Please label the page hypothesis. So what is a hypothesis? A lot of times you'll hear it called an educated guess or an educated prediction. It's really an educated statement based on prior research, knowledge, or observations. And it is always written in a complete sentence, and we kind of use the same formula. What is causing it? What happens when I do that? And why, right? So it's the cause, effect, and why. You may have, in elementary school, done just cause and effect in a hypothesis, but in junior high, we're going to start writing more sophisticated hypotheses. So please pause the video and copy the notes into your composition notebook. So how do you write a great hypothesis? So in a hypothesis, we're going to use the if, then, because formula when writing a hypothesis. So if, and then I'm going to state the independent variable. If tells the reader what will be changed. This is your independent variable. So if I change this, whatever this is, this should be your independent variable. Please pause the video and copy the notes into your composition notebook. Let's go back to the Jimmy and his friend Joe. So you identified the independent variable. So in your example column of if, please write if and what the independent variable is. Or, what's he changing? The next part of hypothesis formula involves the then. So if I change my independent variable, then this is going to happen. The then tells the reader what will happen because of the change described in the if statement. This is your dependent variable in the investigation. Let's go back and pause the video and copy your notes into your composition notebook. Let's go back to Jimmy and Joe. What is a dependent variable in this scenario? So you should have written if whatever the independent variable is in the independent variable example. Now please write then and tell me what you're going to measure in this experiment, or what Jimmy is going to measure in this experiment. So that brings us to because. This is why do you think it's going to happen? The because tells the reader how you know this will occur. It should be based on something you've experienced or something you infer. At this time, pause the video and copy the notes into your composition notebook. So let's go back to Joe and Jimmy. If you would, why will Jimmy, and it should have said Jimmy, why will Jimmy get higher scores if he changes who his lab partner is? This is your reason. So write because, and the reason you think Jimmy's going to get higher scores if he changes his lab partner. A hypothesis has to be testable. It can't just be the sky is blue because it reflects the ocean water. How am I supposed to test that? So a hypothesis must be testable. Pause the video and copy the notes into your composition notebook. So what would a good hypothesis look like? Let's look at two examples. If seventh graders and eighth graders compete in the same math problems or complete the same math problems, then the eighth graders will have more correct answers because they have studied math for 1 year longer than seventh graders. Hypothesis example number 2. If dry bread and moist bread are left in bags for 2 weeks, so if I change this, then the moist bread will mold more quickly than the dry bread. This is what I'm going to measure. Because mold is a living organism, and organisms need waters to survive. Hopefully you now know how to write variables and hypotheses brilliantly.